Quorum.
Believe we are close. Just a second.
Okay.
Yes, we have quorum.
Thank you. So with that, I'll move on to item 2, vote for approval of the agenda. Before I ask for a motion and a second, I did want to note that we do have some visitors in attendance for item 9. And I wanted to ask that we consider moving item 9 up to being right after item 3 so that those visitors can use their time effectively. So we have a motion. Yep.
I'll move approval with that amendment.
Thank you.
Second, Miller.
So we have a motion and a second. So for these virtual meetings, we are not going to have a voice vote in affirmation. We'll just offer an opportunity for any abstentions or objections. So with that, I'll ask, are there any objections to the motion? Hearing none, the motion passes. We'll move on to item 3, approval of the meeting minutes. You have them there in your packet. Does anybody have any discussion, or do we have a motion?
Move, this is Neighbor.
Second, Miller.
We have a motion and a second on the approval of the meeting minutes. Any discussion? Hearing none, I'll ask if there's any objections to the approval. Hearing none, that item passes. So per the amended agenda, we'll go ahead and let our partners present on item 9.
Thanks, Luis. I'll kick this off real briefly. I think you're all aware that District 1 and District 3 are now soliciting applications for community project funding. We shared some of that information in our agenda packet. But we want to give the opportunity for staff members from District 1 and District 3 to speak with you all about any thoughts they have, hopes that they hope to see in your applications. I've not heard recently if they have guidance yet themselves. I know they had begun soliciting those applications without having full guidance just yet. So anyway, that's the purpose of this agenda item. And Tony, Ashley, thank you both for being here today. If you would like to say something, I would invite you to take the virtual podium.
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, Tony, I didn't know if you wanted to go first, but I'm Ashley Beerworth. I'm our legislative director for Congresswoman Marinette Miller Meeks. Sorry, there might be a little bit of background noise. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So we're Iowa 1st District, so southeast corner of the state. And I can put my email address in the chat as well. And if you guys have any questions about applying to community projects to our office, I would be the best person to contact. And I can send you our full guidance, but I think you guys have that in their link as well. So we don't have guidance from committee yet, but we just passed the first mini bus for fiscal year 24 applications yesterday afternoon. So that included all 15 of our projects that we submitted last year. So I'm hoping that the appropriations committee will have deadlines for the fiscal year 25 process coming up here. We tentatively set ours to be March 15th, but we're going to push that back depending on when the appropriations committee requires that applications come in. So I can send an email once that's all finalized, but happy to answer any questions. We did it through an online form. So there's a Google Drive form that you'll click on and it'll go through, I think it's like 20 questions about project description, budget breakdown, community need, And then also, each project will need a couple of letters of support, and there's a specific email address that we ask you to send all of your letters of support in one document to. The process for our office is we have our internal deadline, which we try to set about 2 weeks prior to the committee deadline, just to ensure we have enough time to go through all of our projects. And then the congresswoman individually reviews every project. I think we had like 80 projects submitted last year, and we were only able to select 15, unfortunately. So keep that in mind as well. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have, and go from there. And I guess I'll hand it off to you, Tony.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me, guys. It's great to see everybody again. As you know, I work for Congressman Zach Nunn's office as the outreach director. We are just 2 blocks south of the Des Moines MPO building, so it's great to be here and to be neighborly. Just like Ashley said, we haven't received the guidance from appropriations yet. We are hoping to see it soon, but for now, we're going to keep it a pretty open process. As you've seen in the slideshow, we do have an application form, and we're going to consider most of the documents you send us still living. We want to work with you to be a good partner. So if there is something you send us that winds up not being qualified in any of the bins that are available, we're happy to rework any of that with you guys. If you guys gain additional letters of support, definitely please continue to send us more. Anything we can do to be a good friend and a partner. And as you know, even if you are not one of the 15 project picks, we can still continue to work together. I handle the grants portfolio for the congressman, and we'll continue to help you guys find different avenues of funding through the federal government. But no, really, it's at this point, just if you guys have any questions about our process or what we need from you to see a successful application, I'm more than happy to sit down with you guys individually, whether that's over a phone call, Zoom meeting, or I'm happy to drive over to your guys' offices just to make sure that you guys have the best applications possible. We love being part of the community and helping you guys out. So please continue to send us anything you may need or may be interested in. We are happy to be your partner in any way we can. Thank you.
Luis, I have a question for Tony and Ashley, if you'll permit staff to ask a question.
Please.
Tony and Ashley, could you explain, I've heard you say this, I just think it might be good for the benefit of the rest of the group, of what types of projects are good projects, or maybe that wouldn't be so good with respect to transportation that the MPO focuses on?
With respect to transportation, so there are a couple different project categories that you can pursue. I think more for Tony, your guys' office, probably having Des Moines proper is the transit infrastructure project. So that's public transit, trains, Amtrak, etc. The highway infrastructure project. So that's going to be partnering with Department of Transportation to request funding to facilitate a portion of the highway. And then the airport improvement program. We used this program to help Southeastern Iowa, a regional airport in Burlington, through our project last year. This is a number of construction projects in the airport, security improvements, etc. And then the Port Infrastructure Development Program, which doesn't really apply to us. I don't think even any Army Corps would qualify for that. And the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Projects. I think the most catch-all program under the transportation is going to be the under the Community Development Fund, the Economic Development Initiative. This has the most broad guidance. It doesn't require the state to also submit the project for through DOT. You can use it. You can use this for construction projects on more local roads and not necessarily like highway. So we had, I think, 5 infrastructure projects through the Economic Development Initiative. So happy to walk through any of those questions too.
I also want to mention water projects have been particularly popular, and a lot of discussion about that around the Polk, Dallas County metro area as well. And I know a lot of these types of projects tie into a lot of our road and infrastructure projects as well. So I'm happy to have a conversation about that.
Any members of the committee have any questions?
Luis, this is John Dostart. I just had one quick question. Do we know what the status of the 2024 appropriations requests are right now?
So half of them just passed yesterday, so that off the top of my head, included the transportation housing. So pretty much all of the community projects categories were passed yesterday. So if you had a project that was included or submitted by a member for fiscal year 24, that should have been funded in the bill yesterday, but it included the Commerce Justice Science Bill, the Ag FDA bill, transportation housing, there's interior, energy and water, and there's one other that is blanking, that I'm blanking on at the moment, but can follow up with information about what was passed.
Oh, that answers my question. Thanks, Ashley.
Okay.
Thank you, John. Any others? Well, Ashley and Tony shared their contact information in the chat, and I can see also in our packet, we have additional information. So just really appreciate Ashley and Tony, your time coming to us, sharing this information, helping us with a little bit of guidance on what we might expect. And so we appreciate it.
Thank you for having us, and I'm probably gonna hop off, but again, don't hesitate to reach out to our office if we can answer any more questions.
Appreciate
Yeah.
that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're happy to hop on a Zoom call as well. I also put the contact information for Caroline Sayers. If you haven't met her yet, she is our new, she handles our transportation folder. She's new. So if you get a chance to email her and say hello, please do. I work very closely with her on any of the NPO work as well. So great friend to have.
Thank you both. So next up, we have item 4. We have a report and vote on the federal fiscal year 24 to 27 TIP amendments. Zach, I think you have this one.
Yes, thank you. We have a handful of TIP amendments to approve this month. The first one comes from the Iowa DOT. This is for a project on I-80, University Avenue to north of Douglas Avenue. This project had some increased costs for their July letting, and so they needed to increase their overall project cost from 99 million up to 111 million. So that's why this project is before you. In addition to that, we had a handful of other projects. I would note that these projects are technically in the out years of the TIP, but since we were already taking care of the one for the DOT, we wanted to go ahead and clean up these items as well. So the first one is for the City of Des Moines for the Southeast Connector. This is to add in their infra grant. Very exciting to see this project get this funding. It's been on the books for a long time, and it'll be exciting to see this one move forward with that additional $34 million that they received. So adding that funding in for this project. And then the next 4 are all from Polk County. These projects were included in the county's 5-year program, but they did not get transferred over into the TIP. And so we're just cleaning that up and getting them over to the TIP. Each one of these was awarded STBG funding. So the first one is for a small bridge project, Bridge 667. We awarded $550 in STBG funds, and we want to get that into the TIP. The next one is for the Northeast 23rd Avenue project. We gave a little over $3.2 million in STBG funding to this project. And again, we want to get that added into the TIP. Again, a small bridge project, Bridge 6668, award $500,000 in STBG funding to this project, need to add it into the TIP. And then I believe the final one is another small bridge project that we awarded $350,000 in STBG funding to. Again, all these projects were in the county 5-year program, but this hadn't filtered up into the TIP, and so we need to get them added in there. Staff recommendation is to approve these TIP amendments. Happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Zach. Are there any questions from the committee? So do we have a motion for approval of this item?
I'll move it. Larson, Urbandale.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Thank you. Any objections to the motion? Hearing none, this item passes. Move on to item 5, report and vote on Scott Avenue Dam mitigation change order number 1. Zach, you have this one as well?
Yes, thank you. So we have our first change order on the Scott Avenue Dam project. As they were doing work on the concrete around the bridge, they discovered a few vertical cracks. And so they needed to add in some expansion joints. This was not in the original contract. So we need to do this change order. This is not a extensive change order. The 2 expansion joints are estimated to cost about $1,000 total. But we do have it in our agreement to bring all change orders through the board. So we're bringing this one before you for your approval. Again, a pretty straightforward change order to this project. Happy to take any questions. Otherwise, it's before you for your approval.
Any questions? Looking for a motion and a second on this one?
Louise, this is John Dostart. I'll move it.
Second, Miller.
Thank you very much. Do we have any objections? Hearing none, this item passes. Next up, we have Dylan for item 6, report and vote on the draft unified work program and budget.
All right, thank you. As we've talked about over the last couple of months, the MPO is required to develop a work program and budget for the next federal fiscal year or state fiscal year, which starts July 1st. This identifies all the work activities that the MPO is going to do, various committees that works on these activities, the costs associated, and just kind of our scope of work for the year. And in January and February, we talked to the committee here, as well as the policy and executive committees, about soliciting any projects or other ideas that the members had. We have incorporated the couple that we received back. We're asking for approval of this today so that we can submit it to the DOT by the end of the month, which is the requirement. They'll get us comments back, and then we'll come back in May with a final document. So over the next couple of slides, I'll walk through what made it into the plan or into the work program. We sent out the full document. There's a link to it in the agenda packet that goes into a lot more detail on these, but this is a quick summary of the various projects and what the MPO's role would be and just any other special notes. I'm not going to walk through these one by one, but I will point out a couple of things that came out of, especially the ones that were requested by members or anything that is deemed maybe a little more interesting here. So the first thing on this in task 1, which is our planning activities and studies, so plans, studies, reports, those kind of things. The corridor preservation study, that is something that's been requested over the last couple of years, actually, and we hope to get it into the work or into the long-range transportation plan. There still might be an opportunity to do that, but in case it doesn't make it into that, it'll be something we do separately. This would be identifying areas or corridors on more the fringe that we want to make sure are preserved for future corridors as the region continues to grow. So that's something that, of course, is interest to West Des Moines, Waukese, and Bondurant, and other communities kind of on the edge that are quickly growing. Towards the bottom there, we have a couple of there's DART projects, as everyone knows. DART's going through some planning efforts right now. We have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with DART, so the MPO will be participating with that and working collaboratively with DART, and we've had some meetings on that. One thing that's sort of related to that is an idea for a multimodal economic impact report. This would be something that would look at what the impact of transit, but also bike lanes, trails, and so forth have on the economy. So for every dollar we spend in those, what do we get in return from taxes and wages and everything else that goes into an economic impact report? So that's something new that we haven't seen before, but I think something that's kind of noteworthy. If we go on to the next task, these are items related to data collection, research, analysis. A couple of things here. Towards the bottom, there are 2. One is the data and software. We'll touch on this in the next agenda item too, but if you recall back in December, I believe we talked about this and we looked at a couple different vendors. This would be to actually put budget out there to acquire data like that or subscriptions to help both the MPO, but all of the member communities have data that would be useful in transportation planning and engineering. The other one is the bike ped count program. This is something that we've had ongoing, but we've had a request for more bike and trail counters. So in the budget, we put in there enough counters, and Carl would have to correct me on the exact number, but we put about $175,000 for new trail counters to be put throughout the region. And that equates to, I can't remember, a couple dozen trail counters to be added. So that's something that would be new for this year as well. If we go on through this, task 3 is more of the funding and programming. So this is pretty standard stuff, doing the work or doing the TIP and the SDBG process, tab applications and that sort of thing. So nothing really changes there. Task 4 on the next page would be more of the stakeholder engagement. So this is kind of a combination of our public engagement activities, media relations, but also the activities that we work with people like you, work with our member communities, the various committees that the MPO staffs. So again, nothing really out of the norm there. And then task 5 to wrap it up is our program administration. So again, this is pretty standard. We do have some budget identified for a strategic plan. One thing that we've talked about over the last year as we've gone through some transitions, it's probably time to look more of a strategic plan or at least a governance type of plan. So that's something that more of a policy board discussion, but that's something that could be coming down the pike too. If there's any questions about those projects or anything else, happy to take that. If you go to the next slide, kind of just to reiterate the next steps in the process here. The policy and executive committee meet later today. So once that's approved by them, we'll send this off to the Iowa DOT, Federal Highway and Federal Transit. They'll get us their comments back. We'll incorporate that. Then we'll be back in May for the final approval. So between now and May, if there are other ideas, if there's questions, if we need to make revisions to anything, we still have time to do that. After it gets approved in May, then it becomes amendments, and which isn't a big deal, but it just follows a little different process. Again, if there's any questions about any of this, happy to take it. Otherwise, we'd ask for your approval of the draft.
Dylan, I have a question about, and I think it was on the first slide, but and I know we've had conversations about the Midwest Passenger Rail Compact, the House file that's been going through. I think you had that in there, but can you talk a little bit about what your role would be if that passes and what the MPO would be doing to work on that?
Sure. So I think there was an item on there, and Gunnar, I think the screen, I'm not seeing the screen anymore, but there was an item on there for passenger rail. That was more for the, I think we've talked about it at this committee, but this was more for the intercity rail, or the more local rail that's been proposed from downtown to kind of the northwest through the suburbs there. So that was what that one was for. But that's probably a good point that we should add that in there, because there has been some talk on the Midwest Rail initiative. There's also been a proposal from Federal Rail on intercity passenger rail. And there's a line, this was covered in the register a couple of weeks ago. There was a line that was identified from Kansas City to Minneapolis that would cross through Des Moines. I think it's too early to tell what our role would it be exactly, but I think it's worth acknowledging in there that we would be coordinating with the DOT and the communities in case something does come through, and it probably in terms of identifying stations and impacts to freight rail and those kind of things. So that's a good point to put that in there.
Any other questions for Dylan? Hearing none, Dylan is seeking a vote on this, vote for approval of the draft unified work program and budget. Do we have a motion in a second?
Move to approve, Davis.
Who do we have on that?
There's a motion to approve by
Thank you.
Davis.
So John moved, and do we have a second from Madeline?
Yeah, I'll second, just with that inclusion of the adding the Midwest Passenger Rail work in there as well.
Yep, noted. Any objections? Hearing none, the item passes. Thank you, Dylan. Next up, we also have Dylan for a report and optional vote on streetlight data.
Thank you. As I just mentioned, back in December, we had the presentation, and this is something we've been talking about with a couple of you individually for quite a while now, even a couple of years, as we've researched a couple different projects or platforms out there for transportation data. So we talked with Indrix as well as Streetlight last time, or a couple of months ago. We did a survey to the member communities and to the tech committee. We didn't get a lot of feedback from that, but the feedback we did receive had a strong preference for streetlight. We do have the opportunity in our budget, as I just talked about, to acquire this kind of data. So that's in there for the draft. One thing I didn't really touch on in the previous item, but for that funding, what we're looking at is carving off some SDBG funds off the top. We've done this we've been doing this for a couple of decades now to help subsidize or to help supplement some of the planning funds that we get. In this case, we would just be putting that towards data as well as the bike counters, which goes back out to you all. So the MPO staff would have access to that, but it would all be access for you as well. So specifically with streetlight though, one thing we want to do now is, if there's support for this, is to not wait until the beginning of the fiscal year to start that subscription. There's some things going on, such as the long range transportation plan the MPO is doing, such as the goods movement study that the MPO is also underway with, which looks at freight, truck routes and freight corridors and so forth. This would be very useful for us at the moment. So if there's support for that, we would ask you and ask the policy and executive committee later today to start that subscription sooner rather than later. The proposed subscription from Streetlight specifically is, I think it's $79,000 to be more precise than the $80,000. It includes 2 modules. So there's one for vehicles and there's one for freight. The freight one, we would probably just need to use for a year or so, maybe not even that long, to get the goods movement study done, maybe get the long range plan done, and then we can drop that one off. The vehicle one is probably one that we would keep as long as everyone's finding value of it. The nice thing about this is it's a subscription. So if it works, we can continue doing it. If we find that we're not getting value or you're not getting value, we can always reduce it or drop it. I think that's about it for now. If there's questions or comments or anybody else wants to weigh in on this, please feel free to do so, but that's our request for you.
Thank you, Dylan. Any questions in the committee?
I guess a question, Luis. Dylan, does the vehicle, these modules, they have origin destination capabilities, correct?
Yes, they do.
And then besides speed and volume and
correct.
Right. Okay. So I think just from my standpoint, I would support this. We're having a lot of freight issues or truck traffic issues, so that we're looking forward to the goods movement study in combination with the use of streetlight data to identify where maybe we in the city of Des Moines need to match up better our truck routes with those origin locations or the destinations that are outside the city, so that we don't have people complaining so much, or we recognize those infrastructure improvements that are needed to accommodate the increased freight traffic, as well as comments that I've had or conversations I've had with Ames, Iowa, as well as others throughout the United States in terms of utilizing this data for other purposes to identify from traffic calming issues to identifying where or validating origin destination. And I think it also has value beyond the traditional traffic or transportation group to include or have availability to parks and recreation departments, for example, to identify where people are coming from to the various destinations or from an economic development standpoint. So I think this is a very good move. Try it out. These subscriptions, these data analysis packages are evolving on a yearly basis to enhance and better utilize this big data, this crowdsourced data. And I think it definitely has a place as part of our toolkit to move people and goods in a safe and efficient fashion. Thank you.
Other comments or questions?
I got one question. This is Steve. Just to clarify, would the subscription include like historical, I mean, certain traffic volumes up to a certain year? Because sometimes I get complaints or people inquiring about we did a project, and so then traffic is diverting down a side street. And so I don't know if there's like, can we go back and get volumes for, I don't know, a few years ago? Do we know?
Yeah, I believe, and I'd have to check with Streetlight on this specific year, but I want to say that it's within the last couple, you can't go back 20 years worth or, 10 years worth, but it's maybe back to 2021 or somewhere in there is, I believe, what they told us. But I can confirm that.
And then we do get a lot of requests for sometimes some of this data. Dylan, is there a thought of is there one of the MPO staff member that'll kind of just take those requests and that person gets the data for us, or how do you think it'll work to utilize this?
So with the Streetlight data, the nice thing about it is we can apply for a regional subscription that then allows all of you to have direct access to it. So you would have your own license. And my understanding is that license can then be shared with consultants too that you might be working with. So we'll get all those details figured out as far as, does that mean everybody in the city of Des Moines can have access to it, or do you have like 5 licenses? We'll get those details figured out. That said, if that's something that's a little more technical than what a community might be capable of, or you just don't have time for it, yes, we will be available to take requests, help produce, whatever data maps, that kind of thing too. So when this is approved, then we'll be in contact. I'm sure there'll be trainings and everything that we'll invite people to learn more about how to actually use the tool.
Wow, thank you. This is outstanding. This would be great to check even all the traffic studies we do, and this is outstanding. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Any other questions or comments? So with that, I'll seek a motion and a second on this item.
I move to approve, Davis.
I'll second, Neighbor.
Thank you, John and Steve. Any objections? Hearing none, this item passes. Next up is item 8, the report and optional vote for mobilizing tomorrow employment, housing unit, and population projections. Zach?
Yes, thank you. So you may recall that last month we shared with you the employment, housing unit, and population projections for our long-range plan. And before we get into the discussion today, we wanted to just take a step back real quick and kind of just talk briefly about why it is we do the projections, what we use them for. And so basically, we're kind of required to update our transportation demand model as part of the long-range plan. And to do that, we have to have growth to put into the model. And so we do our projections for that purpose. The model itself and the growth scenario is used for certain things and it's not used for other things. And just to kind of touch on that, it's a tool, the model is a tool to assist us with our regional transportation planning decisions that we make. And I will, emphasize the fact that it's a tool. It's one tool in the toolbox. It's not kind of the end-all be-all tool that helps us address projects across the region, but it is a tool that's out there for us. And it can really help kind of set baselines for studies and IJRs that communities are doing across the region. But it's used in conjunction along with other land use and growth scenarios. So the numbers that come out of the model aren't necessarily, the final set of numbers. They can be massaged a little bit if needed, those projects. What the growth scenario and the model are not used for, they have no bearing on how STBG funding is allocated or any other federal programs. They are not used to determine which projects are built in communities, and they ultimately have no impact really on how much a community actually grows in the future. They are just a best guess at what we see the region at as far as population and employment go in the future. So as far as this growth scenario development, we used, as I mentioned at last month's meeting, we used the same methodology in our last plan update. This methodology was developed through our steering committee process. It ultimately went through tech exec and policy for approval. The only real change that we've made in this update is to look at the new census numbers and update growth rates based on those census numbers. So staff presented these projections back at the February meeting, as I mentioned. It was presented as an optional vote back in February. And I believe in the meeting, we discussed how if the committee was comfortable moving forward with these numbers, we could vote on it. And if not, there was time to still do some additional review. Ultimately, the committee did decide to take that time to do some additional review, and staff requested that if you did have any comments, to please get them to us by the end of February. So we did receive comments from a handful of communities, Bondurant, Norwalk, Pleasant Hill, and Waukee all provided us with comments. And the comments and concerns were shared were all of very similar nature. They really focused in on the population projections and how in those communities they were low compared to what those communities had in their comprehensive plans. And I think there's a couple of different things that are the reason for these differences. As I mentioned in February, the MPO uses a control total, a regional control total. That's a best practice that we've used at least in the last 2 or 3 plan updates. It's something the DOT has always encouraged us to do, to look for an independent outside source to set that control total. Obviously, that keeps growth at a lower amount than what you would see if you just combined everybody's comprehensive plans. I think the other difference is that you're looking at different methodologies between how the LRTP methodology works and the methodologies that you'll see in the comp plans. And I think in addition to that, even the methodologies that are used across the various different comp plans throughout the region are all different as well. So what that ultimately does is it leads to discrepancies between what you see in LRTP projections versus what's in your comp plans. Not to say that either one of these methodologies are right or wrong, they're just different, and it leads to those differences. So the control total, as I mentioned, this is something that has always been a requirement that we've had from the DOT. They've always highly encouraged us to do this best practice. So when we started receiving the comments from the communities regarding the lower rates, we reached out to the Iowa DOT and Federal Highway to have a conversation about whether or not they still viewed the control total as something that we needed to do. We have not heard back from Federal Highway yet. However, we had several conversations with the Iowa DOT, and their recommendation does continue to be that they believe the MPO should use an outside source to develop this regional control total. So over the last couple of plan updates, we have used Woods and Pool as our independent source. This is the same source that is used by the state data center in Iowa. What Woods and Pool does is it develops a projection for the 4-county region. So that would include Dallas, Polk, Madison, and Warren counties. And for 2050, what Woods and Pool is projecting for that 4-county region is a little over 855,000 people in the 4 counties. The MPO projected, what we shared at last month's meeting, and what you'll see in the agenda still today, is 850,000 for just the MPO member governments. So essentially, what our projections are doing is they're taking up 99% of the growth that Woods and Pool is projecting for the entire 4-county region. And in our discussions with the DOT, that was one of the comments that they made, is that they wondered if maybe we should even look at reducing the amount, that control total amount, down even further than the 855, just based on the fact that there are other communities outside of the MPO planning area in that 4-county region. Now, from a staff perspective, I think we feel comfortable with pushing up to that 4-county limit, since a vast majority of the population, we believe, will be in the central Iowa MPO planning area. So I think really the challenge that we're facing is that to maintain the control total, which is a recommendation of the Iowa DOT, it makes it difficult for us to address the concerns and comments that we received from our member governments. As a staff, we didn't really feel comfortable going against what the DOT was recommending. That's why on today's agenda, you see the same information that we presented back in February. If you go to the next slide, I think what we can do is look at several different options that we might have moving forward. We want to make sure that our member governments are, we can come to some consensus about how we want to address our growth scenario. So the first option is with the regional control total. It's just the existing methodology, the one we presented in February. All the options that we're presenting today have some pros and cons. One of the pros of this option is that all member communities are experiencing positive growth. And it also maintains the use of that control total, which is the recommended best practice from the Iowa DOT. The downside or con to this is that it shows slower growth rates than what you would see in some of the member government's comp plans. And because of that, some of the communities have a lower growth than they're expecting, especially as you go further into the out years. Another option that we would have that would allow us to maintain our regional control total would be to retain the control total, but we would have to go through a process to determine which communities going out into the future would grow at a high rate and which ones would not grow at a high rate. And we would have to do that to stay within the control total, but then also meet some of the comments and concerns that we received. The positives of this is that it still maintains a control total recommended by the DOT, and then it would allow the projections to match or could match some of the member government communities' comp plans. On the downside, we wouldn't be able to match every community member's down plans or every community's members' comp plans, but we would have to go through what would probably be a difficult process to determine which member governments we do match their comp plan numbers and which member governments we would not match their comp plan numbers. Another option would be just to eliminate the control total. This has pros and cons like the other two options. The positives is it would address the concerns without having to select, high growth versus low growth communities out in the future. And it would allow us to align more closely with communities' comp plan projections. On the downside for this option, it probably would require us to come up with a new methodology. We could just eliminate kind of the governor that we put on the growth rates in our current methodology, but it would likely lead to us needing to kind of revisit the methodology as a whole. Another downside is that not all communities have recent comp plans. Some comp plans are more recent than others, plan projections, and there's inconsistencies with horizon years and methodologies used for the individual member governments' comp plans. So trying to find something that is consistent, again, would be a challenge moving forward. It goes against the DOT's recommendation for the use of that control total, so we would have to keep that in mind. And if we did move away from that control total, which is being recommended by the DOT, it's possible that it could create some issues for us as we're going through our DOT and federal highway review of the long-range plan. So I think from a staff perspective, option 2 seems kind of like a non-starter. I'm not really sure anybody wants to get into a process where we're having to select communities that get to grow at their comp plan rates and communities that don't. So it kind of really leaves this committee in a position of deciding between, do we continue to use a control total, or do we move away from that control total and possibly have to work with the Iowa DOT through that process and justify why we're doing that. So as I mentioned, on this agenda, staff has kept the recommendation the same as in February. I think from our perspective, we view the control total as an overall good practice, and didn't feel comfortable making that decision. We felt like that was more of a decision that needed to be made by this committee if we determined to move away from using that control total. I think we want to acknowledge from a staff perspective that this is your guys' plan, and if that's the direction you want to go, if you want to move away from using the control total, we will pursue that option. And so I think that's what I have for you at this point. Happy to take any questions you have. At this point, I would open up the floor to any discussion or comments that any of the member governments would have.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah, this is Luke from Norwalk. I just wanted to give kind of our perspective. We were one of the groups that made some comments on that initial projections. And I guess just a couple things. I've thought a lot about this and talked a lot with our local people as well. And the current methodology, just from a numbers perspective, to illustrate why we're concerned with this, gives us 3,000 housing units out to 2050. I can tell you today that we've already grown by 1,000 housing units since the base year that was identified in that. So that gives me actually 2,000 to use, right? So that 2,000 housing units over the next 26 years would say that Norwalk's growth rate is at a level that we've not seen since 20 years. I mean, that puts us back to mid 2000s growth rates. I think everybody in the metro would agree that none of our communities are going to regress back to mid 2000s level growth. So that's one concern that we have, and not just a Luke Paris concern, a city of Norwalk concern from all of our folks. And the other thing that kind of goes against and we struggle with is we've just done a comprehensive plan, and that comprehensive plan has goals and policies and things to work towards for implementation for our own local idea of how we want to grow. And from a transportation perspective, Norwalk is showing growth southwest to the interstate and a new interstate south of the G14 coming intersection with I-35. The idea that we have to hamstring our growth to these artificial control totals seems like it's going to put us in a place of conflict in the future when we start discussing what the realities of Norwalk trying to implement our comprehensive planning goals to meet what we're saying we think is going to happen. I mean, and it's not what we think is going to happen. It's what the city of Norwalk will plan to happen. It's what we're actively working towards happening. And so on one hand, we have these things saying, this is what we're going to do. We're putting in sewer. We've identified land use plans. We've identified corridors. We're studying corridors. We want to drive our growth of the community in that direction. And these projections, I think, put us at a point where we're going to be back to this group saying, hey, here we are. We want to do this thing. And now the numbers that we've had in this thing aren't maybe justifying it when we've been working for this entire time. So I don't know what the solution is. I totally get, I understand the reason for the control total. I understand the reason for the model. I understand all that stuff. Ultimately, if that's what we decide to do, I'm obviously just one vote, but that's our perspective from a smaller community that's trying to implement something that we just approved a year ago in our comprehensive plan, and how that's running up against what we're trying to do here regionally. Thanks for the time.
Can I actually ask a clarifying question? So Luke, just your concern is about federal funding decisions that the MPO
Not
might
necessarily
make?
funding decisions. It's just Zach mentioned in his why do we do this thing and what's it used for, what it's not used for. And so it's not used for how MPO is determining who gets STPD dollars and where that's allocated and everything. And that's a huge part of what we do at the MPO, right? Is helping our members with those financial projects to fund things. But another big part of that is if you're proposing a new interstate on the federal highway system, that's not a small task. That's not an easy task. There's a lot of time, effort, and data involved with that. And again, it's one data point. It's one input to that. And I just see it being something that's going to be revisited in the future. And maybe that's fine. I know the reality is that we're not going to fall back to 2020 or 2004 growth rate for city of Norwalk. And so, I don't want that to hamper our ability to try to meet our comp plan goals and the things the city's striving for. So.
And then Zach, a question for you. In the plan, is there a discussion of how kind of the narrative that you just gave, where this is one input, member communities also are projecting, all the things that you said? Is there a way to describe that so that it's clear that there could be outliers and this is a regional plan, based on uniformity, but that there could be outliers?
Yeah, I think absolutely there's definitely room to include that discussion. I don't think currently the plan probably has a lot of that kind of language in it, but that's certainly something that we could add in there when we're discussing how the model is used to develop the plan. And I think, we want to see, from a staff perspective, we want to see as much growth as possible for our region while also passing the scrutiny of the Iowa DOT and the federal highway as far as our plan goes, because we want to have a plan that gets through that review by them as well. So that's kind of the thing that we're trying to balance from a staff perspective.
Zach, can you talk a little bit about recognizing the control total? How were the percentages of growth assigned to each community, and was that equitably distributed across communities? So you're showing, 2% less growth for Pleasant Hill, but you're also showing the same 2% less growth than what we projected for all of the communities across the metro. Can you talk a little bit about how basically we're all seeing the same less growth with your model, and so it's at least an equitable distribution of less growth than another model or another percentage?
So as I mentioned before, that methodology was developed through the steering committee process in the last update. The growth rates were determined by looking back at the last 20 years of census information to determine how each community had grown. So each community had its own individual growth rate for the first time period of the plan. And then to stick within that control total that the DOT recommends, we had to find a way to bring those numbers down. If we didn't bring the numbers down, I believe if we just took those percentages and went out into the future, I think we were a little over 1 million people. So 150, 200,000 over that control total. So we had to determine a way to do that. The way we did it was we chose to look at high growth and low growth communities, and then to ratchet down the growth of the high growth communities in that second time period, and keep the low growth still going at their rate through that second time period. And then the third time period, everybody kind of dropped down to that regional average. And that essentially was, as you pointed out, Madeline, just to be equitable across the board. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways that it could be done, but that was the way that it was selected in the last plan update.
Thanks for that. Have you done any look at, so of the new model or the new numbers or different numbers that cities have provided you, we're looking at comp plan numbers. I mean, what is the difference between what we provided and Norwalk and Bondurant and Waukee? If you look at all of the cities' comp plans, what is the growth? What's the difference between what we're projecting for our communities versus the Woods and Pool model?
We started looking into that, and we ran into the challenge that I had mentioned earlier, that some of the comp plans are older. Not all of them project out to 2050. We would have had to done a lot of work to get each one of those comp plans out to 2050. So I don't know exactly what that number would be. I believe it would probably be well over the control total number. We did do one exercise to try to kind of test it a little bit, where we took our existing rates, and rather than putting any kind of a control total on it or ratcheting down growth, we just used what one of the basic methodologies that a lot of comp plans use is to project growth out into the future using a compounding rate based on the last 20 years of growth. So we did that. And I think, if I'm remembering right, we were probably at close to 1.4 million when we did that. So my guess is that if we did go through all the comp plans and took the time to do that, we would probably be somewhere in that area, somewhere between, I would guess, 1.2 and 1.5 million people across the region. But we did not end up taking the time to look through everybody's comp plans individually.
Zach, this is Mike Ludwig. I was just going to echo that. I would guess that if we took all of the land area and everybody's comp plans and projected out those being at their maximum of what their plan calls for, we'd be well over these totals for the control totals. I'm guessing most of our plans have more than enough land for growth through 2050. It probably is a much greater timeline than that. I applaud Norwalk for their efforts to do their planning and have their investment in their infrastructure and that. I think they can continue to do that. I don't think these control numbers prevent anybody from doing that. And we'll probably be revisiting these numbers again within the next 5 years, would be my guess. I mean, we seem to do it every 5 years for updates. So I think if conditions change, we continue to move through that and see what the new control total would be at that time. And again, if it's not specifically tied of, well, no, you were only allocated 3,000, so therefore you're not allowed to apply for any more funding. If that's not the case, then it seems like it's maybe not as much of a concern, certainly for Des Moines.
And I guess my thought too, and I just want to recognize, I also have some concerns about this. I recognize the limitations that you're put under through the DOT, but we've done some recent planning. We know, I mean, many of us, our cities, including Pleasant Hill, is about ready or is in the process of doing a special census. We're projecting that our special census numbers are going to show more already in the 2025 number than what's being projected. And I just want to be careful about how these numbers are being used. We recently had a conversation with Des Moines Waterworks, who's trying to project water supply out into the future and is using these numbers, and they are using these numbers to plan for future growth in the metro, not recognizing that we maybe don't necessarily agree with these numbers and that they don't know that these have a growth total associated with them. And so I do like the comment that Luis said about putting some other narrative in with it to recognize that this is one methodology. Many cities have different methodologies to arrive at it, but that we're just not hindering, other entities in the metro are using these numbers without recognizing the limits that you are putting on them. And that will lead to other, the WRA was using these numbers for their modeling as well. And so recognizing other entities are using these numbers as fact for how growth is going to happen in the metro without necessarily checking with those communities if they agree with what their projections are.
Mal, that's a great point. And I know that from time to time, entities do reach out to us and ask for these numbers. And we always try to kind of caution them with how we came about with these numbers and how we use them internally for our long range plan purposes. But I think you've got a good point. And perhaps we could do a better job of just kind of hammering that home to them that this is just one way of projecting, population out of the future, and it has its purposes for us. And maybe we need to make that more clear when we're handing that out to different entities across the region.
I was just going to acknowledge too, Madeline, to one of your questions. Like Zach said, we weren't able to look at everybody's, but from the communities that did submit what their comprehensive plan said, I would say our figures are within the range of that. They're just not, they're on more of the low end. So if you look at the spectrum of, like Zach said, there's 4 or 5, whatever different methodologies they use, and they kind of average them. We're more on the lower end, but it's still kind of within that range. But then what I was going to say the same thing that Mike said, is that we will update these numbers again in before you know it. So if to Luke Paris's point, if the city really starts growing in the right direction and the growth continues at the pace that they have seen and doesn't regress back, the numbers will reflect that. So a lot of these things that we're talking about in terms of interchanges on the interstate, that's going to take many years to come. But this will all, I think, work itself out. In either if something big comes into the region that we weren't expecting, we can always amend these numbers. We can always amend the model. But we'll also be updating these regularly and be able to catch up with what's on the ground at that time and, kind of incrementally keep adjusting from there.
And just in fairness to that statement, I guess, Dylan, one thing I'd mention to that is think we felt our totals were low 5 years ago when we did it. I feel like they're low now, and yes, we'll look at it again in 5 years. And if we keep having a control total that is maybe on the lower side of things, I would expect them to be low again at that point as well. So I appreciate that we'll look at them again. I'm not saying this isn't the right way to move forward with our project now, so that we can get our long range plan done, so that we can move forward with stuff. But just know that, this is something on our radar. We'll continue to look at it, and again, we'll continue to do our planning efforts and do what we need to do. And if we need to come back at some point because something that we see is happening is not necessarily lining up, then we can look at that and do amendments as needed to that point in time.
Are there other comments and questions? Well, I, for one, just really appreciate, oh, go ahead, Zach.
I would say, real quick, I think from a staff perspective, we're especially wanting to make sure that the first time period of the projections is accurate. And I know that in the last update, when we were sitting down individually with each community to put that growth into that first time period, there were times where we were in meetings and communities would be like, we know we've got housing that was built here last year that's not showing up. Because we're pulling information from the parcel database and it might be a little bit behind. So I would say that we want to make sure that information in the short term is especially accurate. And I think I can speak for staff when I say that we're willing to, if you recognize that there's additional growth that you're not seeing in that first time period that would be counted in the base year, we can make sure that we get that in there so that those early years are especially accurate. I just wanted to make that note to kind of address some of the comments that we heard.
So then, Zach, are we approving a methodology, or we're not approving the final numbers at this moment?
We would be approving the methodology along with these numbers. But I guess what I'm saying is we're flexible. We can be flexible to work with the communities if there is growth that they have on the ground that is not being recognized in those shape files that we send out.
Okay. And so if those changes are made, would that necessarily come back to the full committee?
When we did it in the last update, those did not come back to the full committee. It was just each member government being able to recognize where they had existing growth on the ground that wasn't showing up in the parcel data.
Okay. I think maybe I would just ask that it doesn't have to necessarily come back for a vote if you don't think it's appropriate, but just given the level of interest in the item, maybe just an update further on down the line. Should we choose to approve it at this time? And if not, if people wanted more time, I see it says an optional vote. So can you talk a little bit about it? I don't think it's on policy agenda for this afternoon.
Right. We put it on as an option because in case the committee decided they wanted to go a different direction, didn't want to go with the control total, it just allowed them to have that option to either vote on this or choose to send it back to the drawing board for more work.
Got it. Well, I really appreciate the in-depth discussion. Very helpful for member communities, especially Norwalk and Pleasant Hill, sharing their specific questions and concerns and how it might relate to their situation. We do have before us staff's recommendation. And so that is what I'm going to be seeking a motion and a second on.
Louise, I'll move staff's recommendation for approval.
Thank you, John.
I'll second Ludwig.
Thank you, Mike Ludwig. I recognize that there was some concerns about this, and so I am going to ask for objections and just give us a minute. Hopefully, we can count those if there are objections. Otherwise, we could call a voice vote. Seeking a objection, any objections at this time?
Aye. Madeline Sturms, Pleasant Hill.
Thank you. So at this time, I'm hearing one objection. That'll be noted. And just appreciate, again, the in-depth discussion on this. But this time, the committee passes staff's recommendation. Next up, we have item 9. It is a report on the TIP development. Zach?
Yes, just wanted to make you aware that staff will be beginning the process of developing the 2024 through 2025 to 2028 TIP development, actually. We do this every 4 years. This document includes all of the federally funded projects across the region. What we're looking at is we'll be sending out a status report to all the committees with their projects in there and asking them to review those projects. If projects that are currently programmed in 2024 are not going to happen before September 30th, they're not going to be let before September 30th, we would ask that those get rolled over into 2025. As I mentioned, we'll probably be sending those status reports out probably late this month or in early April. And at that time, we would just ask that you review those projects, submit them back to us so we can incorporate them into that draft tip that we'll submit on to the Iowa DOT. So again, just wanted to make you aware that we'll be beginning this process here shortly. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Zach? Thank you very much, Zach. Z, you get to give the update on upcoming events.
Yep, thank you. So for the month of March, we have a lot of webinars, as you can see, but I want to highlight some upcoming ones of interest. On March 8th, we have a USDOT SS4A webinar on supplemental planning and demonstration grants. There's also a webinar on emerging practices for EV charging stations for local governments. March 13th, we have another SS4A implementation grant webinar. March 14th, we have integrating safe vehicles into Vision Zero. And on March 19th, we have safe streets for all funding strategies. I think there are one or two more. March 20th, we have FHWA Iowa Division and Iowa DOT giving a webinar on how they look at discretionary grants. And March 27th, we have a equity in tools and strategies webinar. So there's kind of a lot going on in March. So please have a look through all the webinars and events, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Z. Item 11, we have other items of interest. Are there any other items of interest from either staff or the committee?
Yeah, just want to make sure everyone's remembering that the committee voted a couple months ago to reschedule its April meeting. So it's going to be on a different day than you're accustomed to. It is on Monday, April 1st. No joking. So just want to make sure everyone had that in mind.
Thank you for that reminder, Gunnar.
And Luis, just a quick reminder, we did submit the project solicitation for the LRTP projects back on January 23rd. The deadline to get those projects submitted back to the MPO was originally February 28th. We only received projects from a handful, 3 or 4 communities. So we did open that deadline back up and extend it to March 15th. So if you hadn't had a chance to get your long-range plan projects submitted yet, please do circle back to that Google form and provide us with those projects. We did include a list of the projects from the last plan to help you develop that list, this new list, and we'll be sending out the link to the Google form in the follow-up email, but just wanted to make you aware of that change in deadline to March 15th to please get your long-range plan projects in. Thank you.
If there's nothing else, gosh, it's my first time. I don't know if we seek a motion on adjournment, but I'll seek it anyway. We have a motion, a second to adjourn?
So move, Steve.
Second, Miller.
Thank you. Any objections? We stand adjourned. Thank you very much. See you April 1st.